Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of our podcast. We're so excited to have you here with us. Whether you're on your morning commute, taking a break, or just relaxing at home, we've got something valuable in store for you today. If you're learning English and struggling with translating thoughts from your native language to English, this episode is exactly what you need. We're going to talk about the first crucial step in becoming truly fluent in English: how to stop translating and start thinking directly in English. I'm Adam, and with me today is the amazing Sophia, who has personally gone through this journey of transforming her language learning from translation-based to fluent thinking. Welcome, Sophia.
Hi, Adam. I'm really excited to be here. This topic is so close to my heart because, like many learners, I used to constantly translate everything in my head before speaking. But over time, I realized that the key to fluency is to think in English, not just speak it. So today, I'm looking forward to sharing what I've learned with all of our listeners.
That's awesome, Sophia. Today, we're going to share practical tips, mental exercises, and powerful strategies to help you break free from the habit of translating and start thinking directly in English. If you've ever found yourself pausing mid-sentence or struggling to express yourself in English because you're translating from your native language, this episode will help you make the shift. So, grab a notebook, get comfortable, and let's dive into the conversation. We promise it's going to be both valuable and engaging. Let's get started. All right, let's dive into our first big question. Why do we translate when we're learning a new language? If you're listening to this, you've probably caught yourself translating from your native language to English more times than you can count. Trust me, you're not alone. It's something that nearly every language learner faces. Now think about it. When we start learning English, we often rely on our native language to make sense of what we're hearing and trying to say. Translation feels safe and familiar. It's almost like a security blanket for your brain. But here's the problem. If you're constantly translating in your head, you're not truly thinking in English. Your brain is still stuck in that translation loop, which ultimately slows down your ability to speak smoothly and naturally. Imagine trying to hold a conversation and constantly pausing to translate. It's frustrating and time-consuming, right? So why does this happen? Why do we rely so heavily on translation in the first place? That's exactly what we're going to explore today.
That's such a great way to put it, Adam. Translation is like this crutch for our brain. When we don't have the words, or when we feel unsure about how to express something, we reach for our native language because it feels easier. It's our comfort zone. But here's the thing. This habit, while it may feel comforting at first, actually creates a barrier to fluency. Why? Because real fluency isn't just about knowing vocabulary or grammar. It's about thinking directly in the target language without relying on translation. Now, for many learners, myself included, the fear of making mistakes is a huge factor. You worry about saying the wrong thing or sounding silly. So you think, I'll just translate what I want to say into English first. But this creates a delay in processing, which messes with your flow when speaking. It also causes us to lose the natural rhythm of the language, and we end up sounding stiff and unnatural. Over time, this fear becomes ingrained, and you might find yourself constantly second-guessing your words, which leads to even more translation. And let's not forget vocabulary. We simply don't know every word in English off the bat. So our brain automatically grabs the closest equivalent in our native language. But the problem is, sometimes that translation doesn't quite fit the context of the sentence, which results in awkward phrasing or misunderstandings.
Exactly, Sophia. And that's where the real issue lies. The problem with translating is that it's not just about language, it's about thinking in English. If you always pause to translate, you're constantly running into barriers that prevent you from having fluid, spontaneous conversations. And let's face it, fluency is all about being able to speak without hesitation, right? You want to express your thoughts clearly and quickly, without mentally juggling between two languages. But if translation is your default, every sentence becomes a mini translation project. It's exhausting, isn't it? The irony is that we end up slowing ourselves down by trying to make sure everything is perfect before speaking. And that's why you hear people say, "I know what I want to say, but I can't say it in English fast enough." The brain is stuck in the process of translation, so it takes too long to get the words out. And it doesn't help that many of us are afraid of making mistakes. We're worried about being misunderstood. But let me tell you something. The key to breaking free from this translation trap is simply to trust yourself. Once you let go of the fear and stop relying on translation, you can start to think in English, and that's when real progress happens.
You hit the nail on the head, Adam. Trusting yourself is a huge part of the process. I remember when I was learning English, I would always try to make sure I translated everything perfectly before I spoke, which only slowed me down. But one day I realized that the only way to get past this hurdle was to stop worrying so much about being perfect and just start speaking. Even if I didn't know every word, I had to trust that I could get my point across using the English I did know. The more I did this, the less I found myself translating. Instead of thinking, how do I say this in English? I started thinking, how do I express this idea in English? And the focus shifted from translation to communication. And that made all the difference. The real breakthrough happened when I stopped thinking about individual words and started focusing on meaning, on feeling the language. It wasn't about translating every word. It was about understanding the message. And this shift allowed me to respond much more quickly, without that annoying pause where I'm searching for a word in my head.
Such a great point, Sophia. The shift from translating to thinking in English is a mental game, but it's one that we can all win with practice and patience. So, for everyone listening, let's take a moment and think about this. How often do you catch yourself translating when you're speaking or trying to understand something in English? Is it a conscious habit, or does it happen automatically? The key takeaway here is that translation is normal at the beginning of your learning journey, but if you want to reach true fluency, you need to break the cycle. You need to start thinking in English, and that's exactly what we're going to help you do in this podcast. Stick around, because we'll dive into some practical exercises in just a bit that will help you make this shift and leave translation behind for good. Now that we've explored why we translate, let's talk about the real impact translation has on fluency. Translation may seem like a helpful tool at first, but over time, it actually creates some significant barriers. Think about it. When you're always translating in your head, you're not responding in the moment. You're delaying your thoughts and slowing down the flow of your communication. Have you ever been in a conversation where you're trying to think of the right word, but you end up pausing for what feels like an eternity? That's what happens when you rely on translation. It's like your brain is stuck between two languages, and that causes hesitation, miscommunication, and even frustration. And here's the kicker. When you're translating, you're not fully engaged in the conversation. You're not actively listening. You're just waiting for the moment to switch languages. This disconnect can prevent you from becoming truly fluent, because fluency isn't just about speaking. It's about understanding and responding without those mental roadblocks.
Exactly. And what often happens when you're translating in real time is that you lose the natural rhythm of the language. Fluency is all about flow, right? When we think and speak naturally, it's like music. The words come together in a rhythm, a pattern that feels easy and smooth. But if you're always translating, you're breaking that flow. You start to sound stiff, robotic, and maybe even a little unnatural. Think about it. If I'm speaking in my native language, I don't need to think about every word. It just flows. But in English, if I'm translating, my sentences feel heavy. They feel like I'm carrying an extra mental weight, and that stops me from sounding like a native speaker. And here's something I noticed when I was learning. Translation also affects how confident you feel. If you're constantly questioning your word choices, you can't help but hesitate. That hesitation makes your speech slower and less fluid. It's like you're trapped in this cycle of self-doubt and delay, and it's hard to break out of that unless you make the conscious effort to stop translating in the first place.
That's such a great point, Sophia. The more we translate, the more we get caught in this mental loop. And the worst part is, this loop feeds itself. The more we hesitate and struggle with translation, the less confident we become, and the more we rely on translation to fill in the gaps. It's a vicious cycle. Now let's talk about something we've all experienced, that feeling when you're in a conversation and you're trying to remember the word you need, but instead of naturally pulling it from your vocabulary, your mind keeps going back to your native language for a safe word. You know what I mean, right? It's like your brain takes a detour to your first language because that feels more familiar. But here's the problem with this. The English words you need might be right in front of you, but your brain doesn't trust that. It's constantly second-guessing, which leads to pauses, filler words like and ultimately a lack of fluency. You end up speaking less confidently, and the conversation feels forced instead of natural.
I totally agree, Adam. And it's not just about word recall either. It's also about how translation impacts your understanding of the language. When we translate, we're only focusing on the literal meaning of words, right? But English is full of expressions, idioms, and slang that don't translate directly into other languages. If you're still translating, you'll miss the beauty and nuance of the language. For example, if I translate the phrase, "It's raining cats and dogs," directly into my native language, it's going to make no sense whatsoever. But when I stop translating and start thinking in English, I can understand that it means it's raining heavily. The difference between translating and thinking in English is that thinking in English helps you understand the deeper meanings, the tone, and the flow of natural speech. And that's what makes you sound more fluent, when you understand the language in context and respond accordingly without getting stuck in translation.
Exactly, and this is where immersion plays such a key role. The more we expose ourselves to English in real-life contexts, through movies, podcasts, conversations, the more we start to internalize these idioms and phrases without translating. It's like you start to feel the language instead of just knowing it. You start hearing those expressions in the same way a native speaker would. And here's another thing. When you stop translating, you open the door to faster reactions and more creative thinking. You can express yourself in ways that translation doesn't allow. You might not know the perfect word in English, but you'll start to come up with alternatives on the spot, which leads to a more fluid, dynamic conversation. It's all about responding to the idea of what you're saying, not just the individual words.
Right. And this is where fluency truly blossoms. It's not just about having the perfect vocabulary. It's about having the confidence to speak freely and make yourself understood, even if you don't know every word. That's the real power of thinking in English. You stop relying on translation, and you start using the language creatively. And I can tell you from experience, once I stopped translating, my fluency skyrocketed. It wasn't instant. It took time and practice. But once I made that shift, conversations became easier, more natural, and much more enjoyable. I wasn't bogged down by that mental translation process anymore. And that's what we want for you too. To get to a point where English feels like a natural extension of your thinking, not something you have to translate.
Absolutely, Sophia. That's the goal. Fluency is all about breaking free from that translation cycle and allowing the language to flow. And the best part? This doesn't happen overnight, but with consistent practice, you'll notice a huge difference. So, for everyone listening, if you find yourself translating often, try to be aware of it and challenge yourself to think in English. Start small by practicing with simple thoughts or everyday activities and gradually build up. The more you do this, the more natural it will feel and the easier it will be to communicate fluently. Remember, fluency isn't just about vocabulary. It's about thinking on your feet, responding quickly, and feeling at home in the language. That's what we're working toward, and we're here to help you get there. All right, now let's get to the exciting part, the benefits of thinking in English. If you've been stuck in the translation loop, you're probably wondering, why should I make the effort to stop translating? Well, trust me, there are some huge advantages that come with shifting from translation to thinking directly in English. First off, it accelerates your fluency. When you stop translating, your brain starts to process information more quickly, and you can respond without hesitation. The beauty of thinking in English is that it helps you break free from that mental pause where you're waiting to translate a word or phrase. Instead, your brain is already thinking in English, which makes your reactions quicker and your speech smoother. It's like building a muscle. The more you practice, the easier and faster it gets. Plus, it opens up the door to more spontaneous conversations. You don't have to worry about translating your thoughts. You just express yourself naturally. And when you're speaking with ease, your confidence skyrockets.
Exactly, Adam. And let's talk about another benefit, better comprehension. When you start thinking in English, you begin to feel the language more. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you're listening to an English podcast or watching a movie. If you're translating, you're not fully immersed in the experience. You're pausing and thinking, what does that word mean? Or, how do I translate that sentence? But once you stop translating, you can really focus on the meaning, the tone, and the flow of the conversation. This shift allows you to understand English in context rather than just decoding individual words. You start to pick up on idioms, slang, and cultural references that you'd otherwise miss because you're not stuck in translation. You feel the language, and that's what truly makes you fluent. Plus, you begin to develop a more intuitive sense of the language. You just know when something sounds right or wrong, even if you don't know every single word.
That's such an important point, Sophia. The more you think in English, the more you start to recognize patterns and structures within the language. This is huge for developing both your listening and reading comprehension. You stop translating in real time, and instead, your brain recognizes words and phrases as they come up. This allows you to understand faster and more effortlessly. But here's something that many learners overlook. Thinking in English also helps you develop more natural expression. When you're not focused on translating, you become more creative in your use of the language. You start using different expressions, finding synonyms, and responding more freely. This is why native speakers don't constantly struggle with word choices. They don't need to stop and think about every word they say. They just speak. And you can get to that point too. Thinking in English leads to more fluid, dynamic communication, where you're not constrained by translation.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the confidence boost. I mean, how many times have you been in a conversation and you feel your confidence shrink because you can't find the right word or you're stuck translating in your head? It's so discouraging, but when you start thinking in English, you stop doubting yourself. You stop questioning every word and phrase before you say it. Instead, you just go with the flow, and that confidence radiates in your conversations. When you're confident, you're more likely to engage, to speak up, and to keep the conversation going. And that's what learning a language is all about. Communication. The more you practice thinking in English, the more confident you'll become and the more willing you'll be to take risks with the language, which ultimately makes you a better speaker.
Absolutely. And when it comes to confidence, There's something else that really stands out. When you think in English, you stop overthinking. Translation often causes us to pause, question, and doubt ourselves. But when you're thinking directly in English, you eliminate that pause. It's like you're giving yourself permission to speak freely without the fear of being misunderstood. And this confidence leads to more authentic conversations. Imagine chatting with a friend or coworker, and you're not stuck in your head trying to translate every sentence. Instead, you're able to share your ideas, feelings, and thoughts in a way that feels natural and engaging. And this, I believe, is one of the most rewarding parts of learning a language. Being able to express yourself fully and genuinely without worrying about the technicalities of translation.
And that's such a great point. One of the biggest hurdles we face when learning a new language is this constant fear of sounding wrong. But when you stop translating and start thinking in English, you're also letting go of that fear. You realize that it's okay to make mistakes. That's part of the learning process. And the more you embrace thinking in English, the fewer mistakes you'll make because you'll start to trust yourself more. Your brain will begin to form sentences more naturally, and you'll feel more comfortable in everyday situations, whether it's ordering coffee or giving a presentation at work. The beauty of thinking in English is that it creates this smoothness in your communication, where everything just flows, and that's when you truly begin to feel fluent.
Exactly, Sophia. And to sum it all up, thinking in English isn't just about language proficiency, it's about mindset. It's about freeing yourself from the constraints of translation and trusting in your ability to express yourself in the language. Once you make that shift, you'll see how much more confident, fluent, and comfortable you become. You'll start engaging in conversations with ease, understanding English in its natural flow, and using the language creatively and confidently. The benefits are endless. So, if you're still translating in your head, try today to challenge yourself to think directly in English. It's a gradual process, but the more you do it, the more you'll notice the change in your speaking, your listening, and your overall fluency.
Absolutely. And remember, everyone, fluency doesn't happen overnight, but every time you practice thinking in English, you're getting one step closer to your goal. So, take those small steps today, and before you know it, you'll see big changes. It's all about consistency, patience, and trusting the process.
All right, now that we've discussed the benefits of thinking in English, let's get into the practical part of the process: how to actually break the translation habit. This is where it gets really interesting because it's not just about telling yourself, stop translating. It's about incorporating specific mental exercises that can train your brain to think in English automatically. So let's jump in with the first exercise, the visualize and describe technique. What this involves is simple. Pick an object around you, anything, a book, a cup, a plant, whatever. Now, instead of thinking about it in your native language, try to describe it in English. For example, if you see a cup, you might say, "This is a small ceramic cup with a blue handle and a round base." The key here is to focus entirely on describing the object in English without switching back to your native language. This exercise forces you to think in English about what you're seeing, and over time, it helps eliminate the translation process in your brain.
That's a fantastic exercise, Adam. And another one I love is the inner monologue exercise. It's super simple but powerful. All you need to do is narrate your day in your head, but in English. For instance, while you're walking to work, you could think, "I'm walking to the bus stop now. The sun is shining and the wind feels nice. I hope I'm not late." This exercise helps you get used to thinking in English throughout your day, and it starts training your brain to use English as your default language. What's great about this exercise is that you can do it anywhere, while you're cooking, cleaning, or even waiting in line at the store. It's a low-pressure way to practice, and it makes English a part of your daily life, not just something you study in a textbook.
That's such a great idea, Sophia. The inner monologue exercise really takes the pressure off. It's not about perfect grammar or using complex sentences. It's about creating a habit of thinking in English. Another great exercise is the word association challenge. What you do here is pick a word in English, and then you try to come up with as many related words as possible, but only in English. For example, if the word is food, you might come up with words like meal, eat, restaurant, delicious, or snack. You can even make it more challenging by picking abstract words like happiness or success. The goal is to build your vocabulary, but more importantly, you're training your brain to think directly in English instead of relying on your native language for those connections.
Exactly. That exercise not only helps with vocabulary, but also strengthens your English thinking process. And it's all about building those quick associations. You start connecting words and concepts in English, which helps you think on your feet when you're in a conversation. Now, here's another one I really recommend: the no translation reading. Pick a short text in English. It could be an article, a page from a book, or even a short story. The goal is to read it without translating any of the words. If you come across a word you don't understand, try to figure it out using the context. Look at the surrounding words or the overall meaning of the paragraph, and try to understand what the word might mean without stopping to translate it into your native language. Over time, you'll find that you can understand English more naturally, and you'll stop feeling the need to pause and translate every unfamiliar word.
That's a brilliant exercise, Sophia. The no translation reading technique really helps you start thinking in context. It forces your brain to rely on English language clues, like sentence structure and tone, rather than reverting to translation. Another great exercise is the talking to yourself exercise. It sounds a bit funny, but hear me out. What you do is just speak to yourself in English, even if it's something as simple as, "I'm going to the store now," or "I have a meeting later today." The key is to use English as much as possible in your everyday life, even if you're alone. Talking to yourself helps to solidify your thoughts in English. It makes your brain more comfortable with hearing and speaking English, so when you're in a conversation, it won't feel like such a challenge.
I love that one. And another fantastic exercise is the storytelling challenge. Pick a short story or an event from your life and tell it in English, but don't write it down first, just speak it. For example, think about something that happened yesterday, like going to a cafe with friends. Start by saying, "Yesterday I went to a cafe with my friends. We sat at a small table near the window." Then, continue the story in English. The point is to not overthink the details, just speak freely and try to capture the essence of what you're saying. This exercise helps with fluidity and helps you practice speaking spontaneously. It's a great way to get used to thinking on the spot, without that mental pause where you're looking for the right translation.
Great suggestion, Sophia. Storytelling is such a powerful tool. It helps with not only fluency, but also the ability to think on your feet. Now, one more exercise I want to share is the flashcard drill. This one is super useful for expanding your vocabulary. Create flashcards with words on one side and the English definition or a picture on the other. When you go through the flashcards, don't try to translate the word into your native language. Instead, try to understand the meaning by using the definition or the picture. This will help you connect words with their meanings directly in English, which helps your brain build stronger, more intuitive links in the language.
Absolutely, Adam. The flashcard drill helps your brain form those direct associations with English, and over time, it becomes second nature. You'll stop thinking about translations, and words will start to pop into your mind instantly when you need them. To wrap things up, these exercises aren't meant to be overwhelming. They're meant to be fun, practical ways to build your confidence in thinking in English. The more you practice these exercises, the easier it will become to think in English in real-life situations. It's all about making English a natural part of your thinking process.
Exactly. These exercises are designed to ease you into thinking in English without the stress of perfection. As you keep practicing, you'll notice that your fluency improves and that translation becomes less of a habit. It takes time, but each step forward is progress. So, to all of you listening, don't be afraid to try these exercises. Make them a part of your daily routine, and soon, you'll notice a huge shift in how you use English. All right, let's dive into one of the most powerful tools for improving your English: conversation. There's no substitute for real-life speaking practice. Whether you're chatting with a friend, a colleague, or even just talking to yourself, engaging in conversations is one of the best ways to develop fluency. Why? Because conversations force you to think quickly and respond naturally. You can't afford to translate word by word when you're in the middle of a conversation. Instead, you have to rely on the skills you've been building: your vocabulary, your grammar, and most importantly, your ability to think in English. Conversations push you to be creative with the language, to make mistakes, learn from them, and get better each time. And here's the key: the more you engage in conversations, the more natural and confident you'll feel speaking English, and that's where fluency really starts to take shape.
That's such a great point, Adam. And I want to emphasize how conversations help you practice real-world English. A lot of times we get stuck in textbooks or formal learning environments where the language is perfect and structured. But real conversations are messy. They involve slang, contractions, cultural references, and sometimes even mistakes. But this is where true fluency happens. In real conversations, you're forced to think on the spot, adapt, and find creative ways to express yourself. You learn to handle interruptions, manage misunderstandings, and keep the flow of conversation going. These are all skills you can't learn from just reading a textbook or listening to a podcast. It's about getting into the moment and interacting with people in a way that's dynamic and ever-changing.
Exactly, Sophia. And I want to highlight something else: the power of feedback in conversations. When you engage with others, you get immediate feedback, whether it's verbal or nonverbal. A simple nod, a smile, or even a confused look can tell you a lot about whether or not your message is getting through. Plus, feedback from more experienced speakers or native speakers is invaluable. It gives you the chance to correct mistakes, expand your vocabulary, and refine your pronunciation. If you're speaking in English with others regularly, you'll notice that you'll improve faster because you're actively receiving feedback that helps you fine-tune your skills.
Yes. And this feedback also helps you feel the language. When you're engaged in a real conversation, you're not just learning words, you're understanding the rhythm and the flow of the language. English isn't just about vocabulary. It's about knowing when to pause, when to emphasize certain words, and how to make your speech sound natural. The only way to develop this is through interaction. And here's another big advantage of conversations: you get to practice listening and speaking at the same time. While you're talking, you're also processing what the other person is saying. This dual practice helps you improve both your listening and speaking skills simultaneously, which is incredibly important for achieving fluency.
Exactly, Sophia. And let's not forget that conversations expose you to different accents and dialects of English. If you're always listening to the same accent, whether it's from a textbook or a podcast, you might miss out on how English sounds in different parts of the world. But through conversations, you get exposed to various ways of speaking. You might hear someone from the UK, the US, or even Australia, and each person will have a slightly different way of speaking, using different expressions or pronunciation. This exposure is so valuable because it helps you understand the variety of English in its natural form, making you more adaptable and flexible in your language skills.
That's such an important point, Adam. And there's another thing to keep in mind. Conversations help you learn contextual language. Sometimes we learn words or phrases in isolation, but in a real conversation, words have context. You'll hear how certain phrases are used in particular situations, how jokes or idioms work, and how people express their emotions or opinions. You can't learn this kind of language from a dictionary. It's something that comes from real-life interaction. And when you understand how to use words and phrases in context, it makes your speech much more natural. It also helps you avoid awkward mistakes, like using a word at the wrong time or in the wrong setting.
Right. And if you're nervous about starting conversations, don't worry, it's totally normal. Everyone feels a bit apprehensive at first. But remember, conversations are about communication, not perfection. Your goal isn't to speak flawless English, it's to get your message across. Even if you make mistakes, they're part of the learning process. And the great thing about conversations is that more often than not, people will be understanding and patient with you. They want to help you improve, and they're just happy to have a meaningful exchange. The more you practice, the more comfortable you'll get. And soon, those nerves will fade away.
Absolutely. And remember, you don't need to wait until you're perfect to start speaking. Just start having conversations. Find a language partner, join a conversation group, or even speak to yourself in English. The key is to practice and stay consistent. You'll be amazed at how quickly you improve once you start engaging with real people in English. And the more you practice, the more fluent you'll become.
Exactly, Sophia. At the end of the day, fluency isn't about memorizing rules or vocabulary. It's about the ability to communicate effectively, and that only comes with practice. So, make conversations a part of your daily routine. It doesn't matter if you're speaking to a friend, a colleague, or just a stranger. Every conversation is an opportunity to improve your English. The more you speak, the easier it becomes to think in English. And soon, you'll notice that you're communicating without hesitation, without translation, and with confidence.
So, to wrap it up, conversations are absolutely key to developing fluency. They provide immediate feedback, help you feel the language, improve your listening and speaking skills, and expose you to the rich variety of English in different contexts. So, don't hold back.
All right, let's dive into one of the most effective methods for expanding your vocabulary, using context. Now, a lot of learners rely on flashcards or rote memorization, but the real magic happens when you learn new words in the context of actual conversations or stories. When you hear or see words used in context, you're not just memorizing them, you're understanding how they function within the language. Context allows you to understand not just the meaning of a word, but also how it's used, when it's appropriate, and what other words it typically goes with. So, how can we use context effectively to boost our vocabulary? Well, it all comes down to immersion. The more you expose yourself to English through conversations, books, movies, or podcasts, the more you'll naturally pick up new words and phrases in context.
Exactly, Adam. One of the best ways to learn vocabulary through context is by reading. Let's say you're reading a book, and you come across a word you don't know. Instead of immediately reaching for the dictionary, try to understand what the word means by looking at the surrounding sentences. What's the general theme or tone of the passage? What kind of situation is the character in? Often the context gives you clues about the meaning of unfamiliar words. For example, if you're reading about someone who's fuming after a conversation, even if you don't know the word, you can probably guess it means they're very angry based on the situation. This helps you learn words more naturally, as you're learning them in real, meaningful situations.
That's such a great point, Sophia. And you don't just have to use books to learn from context. You can apply this to movies, TV shows, or even news articles. Imagine watching a TV show and hearing a new phrase like pulling the strings. You might not know exactly what it means, but by observing the context, like the character's actions or the scene around them, you can start to guess its meaning. Maybe it refers to someone who's manipulating a situation behind the scenes. The more often you encounter the phrase in different situations, the better you'll understand it, and the easier it will be to use it yourself in conversation.
Yes. Movies and shows are great because they also give you insight into the tone and emotion behind words. If you hear someone say, "I can't believe you did that," in an angry tone, you don't need a dictionary to understand that they're upset. Context helps you understand not just the meaning of the word, but also how it's delivered. Is it said sarcastically? Is it a question or a statement? These nuances are key to understanding how words function in real conversations. And as you hear these words repeatedly in different contexts, you'll start using them more naturally yourself.
Exactly. And another powerful method for learning vocabulary through context is by paying attention to collocations. Collocations are words that commonly go together. For instance, we don't say strong tea very often in English, but we do say strong coffee. Or instead of saying make a homework, we say do homework. By learning collocations in context, you get a better sense of how words are actually used in everyday speech. It's not enough to just know the individual words. You also need to know what words sound right together, and you'll start to notice these patterns the more you immerse yourself in the language.
That's such a great point, Adam. Collocations are so important, and they're often the difference between sounding like a non-native speaker and sounding like a native. You don't want to sound awkward by using words that don't fit together naturally. By seeing them in context, you can start to recognize which phrases are common and which ones feel a bit off. And here's a fun tip. Try repeating phrases or sentences you hear in movies or conversations. The more you practice them, the more they'll stick. You might be surprised at how quickly you pick up phrases this way. It's almost like you're absorbing them without even trying.
That's a great tip. Another way to use context for learning vocabulary is by taking notes while you read or listen to something in English. Whenever you come across a word or phrase that's new or interesting, write it down along with the sentence or context where you found it. This will help you remember not just the word itself, but how it's used in a sentence. Later, you can review your notes, and over time, you'll start to internalize these new words and phrases in a way that's much more meaningful than memorizing from a list.
Exactly. And this method can be applied to anything you're doing in English, whether it's listening to a podcast, reading an article, or having a conversation. The key is to pay attention to how words fit within the larger context. If you hear or read something new, don't just focus on the word itself. Think about the overall meaning, the emotion behind the word, and the situation it's used in. This helps you connect words to real-life experiences, which makes them much easier to remember and use.
And let's not forget about contextual learning through repetition. The more you hear a word used in different contexts, the more familiar it becomes. It's like building a mental map of the word and its meanings, associations, and nuances. Over time, you'll naturally start using the word without even thinking about it. This is the power of immersion. You're not just learning words in isolation, you're learning them as part of a larger system.
Absolutely, Adam. So, to wrap things up, context is your best friend when it comes to learning vocabulary. Whether it's reading, watching movies, or listening to conversations, the key is to understand how words are used in real situations. By immersing yourself in English and paying attention to context, you'll not only expand your vocabulary, but also learn how to use words naturally and effectively. It's all about connecting the language to real-world situations, and the more you do that, the faster your fluency will grow.
Right. And remember, vocabulary isn't just about knowing a lot of words, it's about knowing how to use them in the right context. So, start paying attention to the context around you, and watch your vocabulary expand in ways that feel natural and exciting. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about one of the most important skills for thinking in English: listening. A lot of learners focus so much on speaking and reading that they neglect their listening skills. But here's the thing. Listening is the foundation for fluency. The more you listen to natural, native-level English, the more you'll start to internalize the language. You'll begin to recognize patterns, phrases, and word combinations that you can use in your own speech. So, if you want to think in English, developing strong listening skills is essential. And the beauty of listening practice is that it's something you can do anywhere. Whether you're on your commute, doing housework, or just relaxing at home, you can always be improving your listening.
Absolutely. Listening is where it all begins. When you listen, you're not just hearing individual words, you're training your brain to understand the rhythm, flow, and natural pace of English. A lot of learners struggle with listening because they try to translate every word in their head, but this slows them down. When you're listening to someone speak naturally, your brain needs to pick up the meaning as a whole, not word by word. This is why it's so important to practice listening to different accents and styles of speaking, because it helps you become more adaptable and able to understand English in its many forms. The goal is to develop your brain's ability to process English as one unit, so you can respond without pausing to translate.
Exactly, Sophia. And one of the best ways to develop your listening skills is by exposing yourself to real, native English. You can listen to podcasts, watch TV shows, movies, or even YouTube videos in English. But here's the key. Don't just listen passively. Engage with what you're hearing. Try to focus on the context of the conversation, the tone, and the emotions behind the words. Listen for those little nuances, how people pause when they speak, how they emphasize certain words, or how they use informal phrases. By doing this, you'll start to get a deeper understanding of the language, which will help you think in English more easily.
Right. And a powerful technique for improving listening is to use active listening exercises. For example, you can listen to a short podcast or a video clip and then try to summarize what you heard. This helps you focus on the key ideas and structures of the language rather than just translating individual words. You could also take it a step further by pausing the video or audio and repeating sentences or phrases. This gives you the opportunity to mimic the native speaker's pronunciation, tone, and rhythm, helping you speak more naturally. Active listening is a great way to train your brain to think directly in English without relying on translation.
That's a great point. Another effective method is shadowing. This is where you listen to a short segment of English and immediately repeat what you hear, trying to match the speaker's speed, pronunciation, and intonation as closely as possible. Shadowing helps train your brain to process and produce English more fluently. You're not just repeating words, you're mimicking the natural flow and cadence of the language. It's like you're building a mental connection between listening and speaking, so when you're in a conversation, your brain can switch to English faster and more naturally.
Exactly. And remember, it's okay if you don't understand everything at first. Listening comprehension takes time, and it's important to expose yourself to a variety of English content. The more you listen to different speakers, the more you'll become familiar with different accents, speech patterns, and colloquial expressions. If you find yourself getting stuck, don't worry, just keep listening. Over time, you'll start to pick up on things that once seemed difficult, and the great thing about modern technology is that you can pause and replay things as many times as you need. So, take advantage of that. Listen actively and give yourself the time to absorb the language at your own pace.
And here's an interesting idea. Try listening to English content without looking at subtitles or transcripts. It forces your brain to rely entirely on the audio, which strengthens your listening skills. This can be tough at first, but it's an incredibly effective way to improve your ability to think directly in English. If you need help understanding, you can always go back and review, but over time, you'll notice that you're understanding more and more without needing the extra support.
That's a great challenge. And to add to that, you can also use different types of media to enhance your listening. For example, if you're watching a news broadcast, try listening to it a few times. First, focus on the main ideas. Then, the next time, pay attention to specific vocabulary or idiomatic expressions used. You can even take notes on unfamiliar words and look them up afterward. This is a great way to expand your vocabulary while improving your listening comprehension. Plus, it helps you see how English is used in real-life situations, from formal news reports to casual conversations.
Right. And let's not forget about listening to different speeds of speech. Native speakers often talk fast, and this can make it hard for learners to keep up. But don't be discouraged. Start by listening to slower content, maybe something aimed at English learners or podcasts with a slower pace. As you improve, gradually move on to more natural speed content. You'll be surprised how quickly your brain adapts to the faster pace as you practice.
Absolutely, Adam. And one last tip before we wrap up. Remember that it's okay to make mistakes while listening. Don't stress if you don't understand everything right away. The more you practice, the more your listening skills will improve. Over time, you'll begin to think in English without having to go through the translation process in your mind. You'll understand the language as a whole, and that's when real fluency starts to kick in.
Great advice, Sophia. So, to sum it all up, developing your listening skills is key to thinking in English. Listen actively, use shadowing techniques, expose yourself to different accents and speech patterns, and don't be afraid to challenge yourself by listening to content at a faster pace. Remember, the more you practice, the more you'll start processing and thinking in English naturally.
Exactly. And keep in mind, every time you listen, you're not just learning new words, you're training your brain to think in English. So, start listening every day, and over time, you'll see massive improvements in both your listening and your overall fluency.
Now that we've talked about practical strategies for thinking in English, let's address something that often holds learners back: the psychological barriers. These are the mental blocks and fears that can prevent you from fully immersing yourself in English. Sometimes, even when you know the language, your brain just doesn't want to switch into English. Why is that? Well, it's because of fear, self-doubt, and the pressure to be perfect. You might think that you have to speak flawlessly, or that making mistakes means you're not fluent, but that's a huge misconception. These psychological barriers can really hinder your progress. So today, we'll explore how to overcome these mental blocks so you can start thinking in English without hesitation.
Exactly, Adam. One of the biggest barriers that learners face is fear of making mistakes. A lot of people are so afraid of speaking wrong that they hesitate to even start speaking. It's a vicious cycle because the more you hold back, the less comfortable you become and the more difficult it is to think in English. But here's the truth. Making mistakes is normal. In fact, it's necessary. Every time you make a mistake, you're learning something new. The more you practice without worrying about perfection, the faster you'll improve. So if you make a mistake, just laugh it off and move on. That's how you grow.
That's a great point, Sophia. Another barrier many people face is the feeling of self-consciousness. You're talking in English, and suddenly you become hyper-aware of your accent, your grammar, or the way you're pronouncing words. You might start second-guessing yourself, and that makes it even harder to think in English. But the key here is to shift your focus away from yourself and onto the message you want to communicate. English is a tool for communication, not a test. The goal is to convey your thoughts clearly, not to worry about sounding perfect. When you take the pressure off, your brain can more easily switch to English because you're no longer focused on judgment.
Right. And let's not forget about fear of judgment from others. A lot of learners worry about what people will think if they don't speak perfectly. But here's the thing. Most people won't even notice the small mistakes you make, And if they do, they're likely more focused on what you're saying rather than how you say it. In fact, most people will actually appreciate that you're making the effort to speak in English. So, let go of that fear. When you're more relaxed and open, your brain is more willing to think in English without feeling constrained by self-doubt.
Exactly, Sophia. Another psychological barrier is the comfort zone. When you're used to thinking and speaking in your native language, it feels safe. It's what your brain is comfortable with. Switching to English can feel unnatural, and that discomfort can lead to avoidance. But the only way to overcome this is through deliberate practice. You have to push yourself to use English in real-world situations, even if it feels awkward at first. Over time, that discomfort will fade, and English will become the more natural choice. Think of it like exercise. The more you practice, the stronger and more natural it becomes.
Exactly. And there's also the issue of perfectionism. Some learners wait until they're 100% sure they're ready before they speak in English. They might feel that they need to be fluent or fully prepared before they can communicate effectively. But the truth is, waiting for the perfect moment or perfect English is just another form of procrastination. The best way to overcome this is to start speaking now. Even if you don't feel completely ready, your brain will adapt as you go. The more you practice speaking in real situations, the more confident you'll feel, and the quicker you'll improve.
And let's talk about the barrier of negative self-talk. Some learners have an inner critic that constantly tells them they're not good enough or that they'll never be fluent. This self-doubt can be paralyzing. But here's the thing. Your inner voice can either be your biggest ally or your worst enemy. If you keep telling yourself you're not good enough, that's what you'll start believing. But if you start saying things like, "I'm improving every day," or "I'm making progress," you'll notice a huge difference in your mindset. It's all about shifting the way you talk to yourself. The more positive and encouraging you are, the more likely you are to push through the challenges and start thinking in English more confidently.
Yes, a positive mindset is key. Another thing to consider is setting realistic expectations. A lot of learners expect immediate results and can get frustrated when progress seems slow. But language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. You have to be patient with yourself. Celebrate the small wins, like having your first English conversation without translating or understanding a movie without subtitles. These moments are huge milestones, and they're a sign that you're on the right path. Don't let impatience hold you back from making real progress.
That's such a great point, Sophia. So, to overcome these psychological barriers, here are a few things to keep in mind. First, embrace mistakes as part of the learning process. Second, let go of the fear of judgment and focus on communicating your message. Third, push yourself out of your comfort zone regularly, even if it feels awkward. Fourth, let go of perfectionism and speak English as much as possible, even when you don't feel 100% ready. And finally, replace negative self-talk with positive affirmations to keep your mindset in a place of growth.
Exactly. Remember, thinking in English doesn't happen overnight, and it's okay to have challenges along the way. What matters is that you keep pushing forward. Overcoming these psychological barriers will not only help you think in English, but will also make the learning process more enjoyable and rewarding. So, take a deep breath, let go of the fears, and just start practicing. You'll be amazed at how much progress you can make when you allow yourself to grow without fear.
Well said, Sophia. So, to wrap up, overcoming psychological barriers is key to unlocking your full potential in English. Don't let fear, self-doubt, or perfectionism hold you back. The more you practice and push through these mental blocks, the more natural thinking in English will become. And remember, it's all about progress, not perfection. Well, that brings us to the end of today's podcast. We've covered so much, from why we translate to how to break the habit and start thinking in English naturally.
Absolutely, Adam. It's all about practice, patience, and the right mindset. Conversations, context, and listening skills are such powerful tools to help you along the way.
And let's not forget, every small step counts. Fluency doesn't happen overnight, but with consistency, you'll see real progress.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow our channel for more helpful conversations.
And keep practicing. You're closer to fluency than you think.
See you in the next episode. Until then, happy learning. Bye for now.